Right. Hello and welcome, everyone. We are now starting our little webinar interviewing the Whiskey Bandit Hunters. Thanks to everyone who's joining us tonight. I am checking in from a airport hotel in Barcelona, so I'm looking a little scruffy at the end of my holiday. I hope you all can forgive me. As we talk about what we believe to be a pretty ugly situation in the whiskey industry. So my name is Felipe Schrieberg. I am a whiskey writer and author. I host tastings. I do some stuff around whiskey and music. I'm a keeper of the quaich. And I've been following this issue for a few years now. And last year, I started a little website called Protect Your Cask with my pal, Mark Littler, who you'll see there as well. Mark is a cask broker and probably the first person, or one of the very first, to really raise the issue of the current wave of problematic things we're seeing around the concept of cask whiskey investment. We are joined by Laurence Cook. Very honored to be joined by Laurence Cook, series producer for the Hunting the Whisky Bandit BBC show, both a show and a podcast, where they've broken new ground on the cask whiskey investment issue in a way we've not seen before. So that's a very, very quick intro. Now, with that, I'll be kind of posting things and then kicking questions to Laurence and Mark as we go, but I'll do a very quick run through. Now, I believe most of the people joining us are going to be tied to the whiskey industry in some way, and thank you for joining us if you are. Now, I'm going to do a very quick introduction to what we believe is the problem and the viewpoint that we're coming at this problem from, and from there, asking questions and doing some analysis around the issue. Now, if you're into whiskey in some way, most of you have seen the ads. A few years ago, we started to see a bunch of firms pop up promising a lot of money from putting money into whiskey casks that will very quickly make you a fortune, right? And over time, and what the reason Mark and I got very worried is that we were seeing outright lies being put on these promotional materials around cask investment. We were seeing misinformation and aggressive sale tactics being used to sell casks with promises of big returns, and none of it really added up. Now, at this point, years later, and as these firms have grown, I would say personally, in my opinion, any firm that is advertising sales of whiskey casks as investment to the general public are pretty hard to trust. And the way that most of these firms work is they're either selling something that doesn't exist, or they're selling something that does exist, but the prospective client or investor is massively overpaying for it. Now, another thing we're going to talk about later is some people do actually make money from this. And it's because you're essentially looking at this sort of kind of a pyramid scheme type scenario that we'll go into details later. And we'll talk about that later. Now, one of the things that we're seeing very recently as well that I personally also find very disturbing is that we're seeing firms that have lied, frankly, and used misinformation. They're building more and more links with established whiskey businesses, organizations, festivals, and industry individuals in order to legitimize themselves as part of sort of the overall whiskey fabric and whiskey community. And that's something that we think is a problem. We also believe this problem of whiskey cask investment being run as a scam, we think this problem is huge, and it's much larger than is being reported so far. We think that the current wave of what we're seeing is many orders of magnitude larger than the last scammer wave of 25 years ago. And it's our opinion, based on what we've seen, heard, researched, that the industry response to the problem has been fairly lackluster. With that, I've covered a quick run through over what we think, where we're coming at this from. Laurence, I will get to you, and we are going to grill you. But Mark, anything you want to add to the quick thing that I just did there?
Yeah, I think the obvious one is that Wauga has now gone. So this regulatory framework that a lot of these investment companies used to hide behind, in terms of, they used to say, oh, you can't take delivery of your cask, or you can't have a delivery order, or you can't have that cask in your own name because of Wauga. That's now gone. So as of the 3rd of March 2025, the Wauga framework has been completely dismantled. And, I think we've got to address, is it problematic? Well, London City Bond and Octavian can manage millions of cases of wine for people in that same level of duty suspense, and arguably it's a little bit easier to nick a case of wine than it is a whole barrel of whiskey. So basically what it means is that now Wowger's gone, there's nothing stopping you. There never was anything stopping you in the first instance, but now that Wowger's gone, there's literally nothing stopping you getting these casks that you purchased into your own name. And that is a crucial thing that we'll probably come back to again and again in this broken record chat. But
something that I'll quickly mention as well is the bedrock of ownership of a cask. And this is something that the scammer, that firms that have issued lies about this, or a lot of firms that have gone around this for some reason. The bedrock of whiskey cask ownership is that you, as a purchaser, have contact with the warehouse. That's the main rule. You're able to have contact with the warehouse, and the warehouse knows it's you. Everything else is details almost. And we've seen some very creative ways of getting around those details.
And I think what me and Felipe and everybody else in the industry have been warning about for years, what this BBC documentary did perfectly was highlight everything that we've been saying all along. Oh, my casks aren't there. Oh, I paid too much for them. Like, and I think that's what like Laurence and your sort of team did there really well in terms of sort of like it brought people's faces to these problems really.
Yeah, absolutely. So now we are going to kick it over to Laurence Cook. So what I'll quickly say is Hunting the Whisky Bandits is so important because we're seeing the first time that we're hearing from victims. I think that's probably the most powerful thing. The actual work you've done, Laurence, is absolutely unbelievable. It breaks new ground on the issue that hasn't been touched on yet. So thank you so much to you and your team for the phenomenal work that you've done. So I guess my first question to you is, how did you start coming at this problem? What made you realize that you wanted to work on it? And we'll go from there.
Well, for me, I'm freelance. I'm a freelance audio producer. So whatever comes my way is what I want to work on. But with this story, I had done a podcast called Trumped, which was all about Donald Trump's Aberdeenshire golf project. And so I'd worked with The Big Light, which is an independent production company based in Glasgow, on a big, complex narrative documentary. And that is, for me, as an audio producer, the kind of that's the star that you're heading towards. What you want is a really incredible, knotty story with lots of great voices. And so when the company said, we have this whiskey podcast, like the disclosure team at the BBC, I think I kind of was putting my head in my hands thinking like, hold on, I've just come from Donald Trump, who's the best character ever to have in a podcast, right? He's everybody's nemesis at the moment, but you know, in this story, he was Scotland's nemesis and Scotland's best friend at the same time. And so I came to this being pretty cynical about it, you know, being as electric as that. What then happened very quickly was that the disclosure team, who are an investigative journalist team at the BBC, told me, well, they sat me down and they said, look, this is the work that we've done so far. And Sam Poling, who's the reporter on it, gave me a PowerPoint presentation, which detailed just a slither of the findings. And just that little kind of amuse-bouche was enough to let me know that this world of Cask Whisky Investment fraud and the people behind it was just as mad and just as bad as any other story that I'd worked on, but also it was ongoing, right? This is not a historical story, this is something that's happening right now. So there was a real, you know, public interest angle to this, which was about catching the baddies, right? It was about, you know, proving that these people are doing what victims were saying that they were doing. So for me, I knew nothing about Cask Whisky Investment. I like to drink whiskey, but didn't really have, you know, a huge amount of knowledge. And actually, I think it's probably quite important that this was made by people who could look at whiskey as a commodity rather than as something kind of holy, not to, you know, kind of characterize people in the industry sort of too much in that direction, but it was useful to look at it as basically a criminal commodity, a thing that you can use to extract money from people. So we came to the story, and Liam McDougall, who was the producer on that, had a tip-off from an anonymous source, and that tip-off, you know, usually if you get a tip-off, I would hazard a guess that it's this person, that person, one or two people This was an email that detailed around 100 names. So what we immediately knew was that the scale of this was massive. And secondly, as soon as the team began reaching out to victims and we started finding people all over the place and of infinite variety, in terms of backgrounds and amounts that they'd invested, we also just found huge numbers of victims. So what was very, very clear early on is this is not either, a couple of people ripped off, on the scale of £10,000 or something like that, or something that was particularly applicable to one group. This is not something that affected well-to-do retired people. This was right the way through every strata of British society, and the people that we spoke to in America very similarly. It was right the way through from youngish people to retired people, right the way through from people that had built up their own businesses and always worked for themselves to retired army majors, like everybody from every background. So there was an incredible human story in this, which was a lot of people had been exploited by a group of people, a fairly large group of people, working with kind of impunity. And that was something worth looking into. And when we started out, what we had was a list of names and victims and a sense of where the investigation might take us, but nowhere near were we able to predict, what actually kind of came from the story.
Man, I'm very sorry to hear that. And it's a shame that it's gotten so bad, So I guess, so you've actually answered my first question. Was going to be, I wanted to ask you more about the victims that you encountered. But so I guess from there, what I'll ask is, so in the stuff you've done, you really specifically focus on the BBC show. It's 3 firms, right? It's Cask Whiskey, Cask Spirits Global, and Whiskey Scotland. And you also interviewed Casey Alexander, but that's more in the US, what he did. So I guess my question is, how many more bad guys are there beyond these 3? And you talked, and how many victims did you speak to? And then I guess I'll throw out just a barrage of questions. How much money are we talking about here, do you think? Or at least in terms of the people you spoke with, how much money did the victims lose in totality? And do you even have something remotely of an estimate of how much you think people have lost so far?
So to to try and answer those, how many bad guys are there out there? I mean, the simple answer is, I don't know, but a lot. If by going by the tip off, that seems to suggest that there are 100 names working, working or having had a kind of role in cask trading, and maybe now dormant. And in terms of but in terms of proving that, the resources that we had for the show meant that we could focus in on a few, and there were investigations that we did that we didn't publish for various reasons, but ultimately it would take an army of investigative journalists to do the work to go through that list in its entirety. I think what I can say with some certainty is that the names on the list that we didn't get to doing a detailed investigation on, it was fairly obvious once you started doing some digging, and often it was a case of finding out somebody's real name or past name, or finding a previous business name. It's fairly obvious once you started digging on a few of them that there were links to previous commodity scams, be that wine, gold, art, whatever, that these were people working with an MO basically of sell a asset that you tell the customer is a tangible thing that will go up in value, but it's tangible, but they don't touch it, right? It stays in storage. So fine wine was a kind of common denominator across a lot of the people that we looked at. They'd previously been involved in property abroad, things that basically you have to take on trust. In terms of the scale of victims and the scale of loss, so the victims that I'm pretty sure that Liam spoke to maybe 20 victims, and another member of the team probably spoke to another 20 victims of just one company. So that's maybe kind of in the region of 40. We know that for one company, it was 190 victims, and when that person was confronted, they actually upped it to 200 plus. If you take so Craig Brooks is a good example. He is the focus of the TV documentaries, the focus of the podcast as well, and his story kind of runs across it. And he's confronted by Sam in London. Now, he had previously been arrested for a fraud with his brother, and that had 350 plus victims and took about 6.2 million pounds. Now, we can't say with any certainty, we can average out a kind of, I don't know, maybe 50,000 pounds per victim, but we're just guessing. But what we know is that is someone who has worked on that kind of scale before. So it's very hard to give exact numbers beyond the numbers that we kind of publish in the series and in the show. But yeah, a lot.
And I think there's two things that you can pick up on here as well, in terms of, like, I think scammers is quite a difficult word to use, because you can't really prove with certainty that these people are scamming right now. And this is what the difficult thing is. It's that the legitimate people are acting in an identical way to the illegitimate people. So the people that are doing this completely as fraud with no intent to do any good whatsoever are acting in the same way as those who are trying to be legitimate. They're all like common denominators. No one was transferring the assets to the customer. Like you said, it's hands off, it's trust us, don't worry about this. And I think all of these firms have been, well, not all of them, there's a high degree of them that have been flexible with the truth and, manipulating this lack of an industry voice. And you know what, like, if anybody's watching this in the industry, like, we're all just sort of like sleepwalking into our own fate here. Like, I think that, and this is kind of coming back to the point about how many numbers of scams are, that I don't think many people even know that they've been manipulated yet. And I think this is kind of like where the weird element of fraud comes in, because where is it fraud and where is it not fraud? Because, marking up commodities that's just what, like, art galleries do. Like, it's hard to prove that. But I think for me, a lot of this has been the deception. Like, would people have given 100 grand, 50 grand, 10 grand to a company knowing that they didn't own that asset and they just had a piece of paper? Because in America, and I've got a little thing here to show you now, in America, since the 1970s, early 1980s, I believe, like, selling a cask on a certificate has been issued or classed as a security, because it's not an asset, you're selling as a security. And there you go. Here's the SEC newsletter. I don't know if you can see this, from January the 8th, 1974. So this is the SEC, and there's 4 points here. Consumers cautioned about investing in whiskey casks, a rate of return of 20 to 25% a year, investments and sold manipulatively, prices are not fairly represented. And like, it's just the same thing. This has been going on 50 years. And I think the problem is there's so much truth to what they're saying in terms of these companies. There are great returns, or there have historically been great returns from buying and owning a cask of whiskey. Go back to 1996, you could buy a cask of Macallen for £1,500. Go back to 2005, you could walk up to the Macallen distillery and go and buy a cask from them for £5,000. And I think it's the way that it's all blurry. So there's probably a lot of people out there now who don't own their casks, have got no proof that they're there, and don't even know that they're part of a scam. And I think that's the worrying thing. I think there's a lot more left to unravel with this.
We will go into more of this, Mark, for sure. I actually want to check in because I'm actually not able to monitor very well comments and feedback, because we've got this across LinkedIn.
No comments coming in yet.
Well, we have a question from Instagram from Andre Almeida, who runs the Inside the Cask website and blog. And Andre asks a really good question. I assume this would be for Laurence. Laurence, any reaction or contact made with the team behind the program and podcast from government or public bodies? It says, I believe in the show, that you're cooperating with the police. Has there been more from that side of things?
Yeah, so we're not cooperating with the police as such. We just were in contact with the police about an ongoing case. But as far as I know, no, there hasn't been any contact from anyone. we were aware and were monitoring one of the active police cases, and we were able to kind of get a sense of where that was at. But no, we haven't.
Okay. Then another question for you. So you're talking about the way that these guys run their operations, how they came in from different commodities markets, et cetera, have run different kind of scams at specific scales. In your investigations, do you think because we found they all came in at the same time, you can almost time it from one day to the next. The ads sound the same, the websites look the same, but it's different firms. Are they, how much are they linked? Are we looking at more, is there like an organized crime link here where they're all heads of a hydra? What's your take on, based on what you were seeing?
So interestingly, there were a couple of individuals that we didn't name in the podcast or in the TV series, which did, they kind of branched across a couple of companies. So I think that there are, at a relatively low level within those companies, there are salespeople who are either unaware. I suppose the most generous version would be that those people are unaware of the risks to customers when they're selling Cask Whisky Investment, because they are basically just professional salespeople. And if you look at their histories, they will have hopped around various different things. We saw people who had worked for, like, double glazing and then had hopped into the cask whiskey industry. Right now, my guess would be that they knew as much about cask whiskey as I did, like entering into this, and that they cribbed their way through and had a sales pitch. But we didn't see, I don't think there's any evidence that I have to suggest that there is a really coordinated effort from a single kind of organized crime group. What I would say is that the way that the companies that we featured do operate is serious organized crime. They are working to defraud people, and they're doing it in a very organized manner, and they're taking large sums of money. I mean, that's the kind of basic thesis of the project for us, is that we set out with the best of intentions to find people who maybe had bad business practices, or careless, but in actual fact, what it seemed is that people had the intent to use whiskey as they had in past guises and with past names used other commodities to take the money and run, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. In the comments, so tied to what you just said, in the comments, we got Gary Mills, another lovely industry fella, who has commented, the whiskey industry isn't set up for individuals to own cask at any scale. Even with legitimate cask investments, the exit routes are limited and complicated, hence why it's so easy for the scammers. He is absolutely right. The system was not made for this. But even so, you've got the Fraud Act, you've got the ways in which you're supposed to legally own casks. So in a way, the laws are there. It's just when you want to come in with the intent to commit fraud, I guess there's no immunity system. There's no antibodies in our industry that have managed to deal with this. I think what's also partly a real shame is the industry is not learning the lessons of 25 years ago, and the scale has gotten larger. One more question for you, Laurence. I'm going to shift it away a little bit from what we were discussing. So when we're talking about victims and how they got reeled in, because for us, I believe, we do believe that the scale is so much larger than 25 years ago. The scale is so much larger than from the 25 years before that. So the 70s we're talking about there, Mark, is how much does social media play a role in luring people in here?
Massively. I think that the sophistication with which the companies that we looked at operate on social media it's truly impressive, right? I know that they're people with bad business practices and they're out to defraud people, but these are people that can build slick websites, slick social media profiles. They're people that are committed to creating content that is targeted, they can find leads, to use the kind of sales kind of terminology of it, right? There was a day not very long ago, perhaps 10 years ago, in which these people would be cold calling, and that's the huge difference. The victims we spoke to found their way to that company. So it wasn't that someone called them up and they said, "Hey, look, I've got this amazing deal." These were people that were interested. The victims were people that were interested in whiskey investment. In the most part, they're people who are hugely passionate about whiskey and wanted some involvement in it, or they were people who had been targeted by ads telling them that whiskey was a brilliant investment, offered great return, excellent exit opportunities, as much money as you like, 10-15% guaranteed. So it's an entirely different landscape from the cold call version of things. And I think that's really important, because none of the victims that we spoke to, none of the ones that were featured and none of the ones that we spoke to for background research, none of them are stupid people. None of them are rubes. None of them are schmucks. These are intelligent people who have spent their lives making sensible financial decisions. But they're people that have been basically groomed into believing that this is a great thing. Now, I would say social media plays a role in that. The advertising on there plays a massive role. I would also say that vanity awards play a massive role. There's an air of legitimacy that these companies can build themselves by collecting a lot of awards from places that give them out for £2,000-3,000 a table. I would also say that a lot of papers online will run advertorials. There are companies that we featured that had paid for content that said the top 10 alternative investments or whatever. Now, they featured companies that are part of our investigation, and they're still up. Those advertorials are still up right now. It's just easier than ever to position yourself online as a legitimate and respected and established company. And that's the thing, that when people arrive at your website and click inquire and get the phone call, you have already skipped 5 or 6 psychological jumps. You've already got somebody who is ready to invest and interested, and you can master manipulate them then through to the investment.
Can I just sort of ask you on that as well, like how much do you think the lack of counter narrative from the whiskey industry itself has been detrimental to that, or not helpful? Because there just hasn't, other than like what we're doing, like who the hell are we? Like we're just like people that are trying to be out there when nobody's in the industry in the scheme of the industry, and yet it's reliant upon us. And like for a long time, the Scotch Whisky Association advice, which they've been publishing since the 1990s, was very difficult to find on their website, and they say it's not their position to police this, but there's nobody else like that was where people could turn to for that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that it is one of the kind of constellation of issues around this. And I would say that there is both there is the whiskey industry, from my perspective, is pretty nebulous, right? There is no Mr. Whiskey at the head of things. Like, there are different groups with different interests, and you talk to warehouse keepers and they'll say something different to distilleries and so on, and traders, and so there is no simple front page for whiskey. Now, trade magazines where there have been articles about this, those are pretty inaccessible to the public, and they're probably there somewhere in a PDF, but really there is no front page to kind of post that stuff. And I think that's difficult.
Sorry. And I was going to say, like, how surprised are you as well? Like, because these guys, they can't sell stock that they don't have. Well, they could sell stock that they don't have, but like they're obviously getting supply, and a lot of these are getting supply direct from distilleries themselves, or in the sale of a lot of brokers are supplying. They know who the hell they're supplying these casks to, and the warehouses know who they're storing these casks for. Like, they're not acting in isolation. So like, how surprised are you that they're allowed to continue like that then, or is that surprising compared to like other industries, or is this just where there's money in their sales and somebody with a sales target to make, they'll sell to whoever to make that target?
Yeah, I mean, it is pretty surprising. I guess I would probably say that even beyond the selling too, I think what I found most troubling is certain distilleries vouching for those companies. Now that's a step beyond just selling your stuff, right? You know, I think that even the least cynical of the investors that we spoke to would understand that the thing that they're investing in is whiskey, and someone somewhere wants to sell that whiskey. You're going to hold on to it and make money on it, but ultimately they understand there's a bargain in there. I think what's difficult is that we found one of the companies, one of the investors, one of the victims, had really gone to town with doing their due diligence. They had phoned around and they had spoken to the manager of the distillery that was supplying this company, and they said, "Yeah, we know these guys. Yeah, they're great. You know, we sell whiskey to them." Now, that's the I think the real problem is. What you're doing, you're offering this sense that these people who, none of whom we could find were based in Scotland, none of the stories that we focused on were based in Scotland, who had no real connection, no tangible connection to the whiskey industry. They were getting people to vouch for them, and there were people willing to vouch for them. And I think that's really dangerous.
One of the things I'll step in with, because Mark made the comment, and actually the three of us were having, just before we went online, we were having a little discussion about this. Mark talked about how some of the people doing business with the bad guys kind of knew what they were doing. I actually am not sure if I agree 100% with Mark on this. I've had quite a few conversations with people within the industry that I think don't see the scale of the problem. For some reason, there's not that. People don't know, even within the industry yet, just how bad it is, and they think more it's from the early 2000s. It's some bad eggs. It's some people that did some bad choices. Some people that were honest but ran a bad business, and it is what it is. And they when they see business being done with these kinds of firms, they don't see it as necessarily a sign of something more systemic and toxic going on, and that helps enable these firms to be able to legitimize themselves in the whiskey community. The other thing I should mention, by the way, we've been using the word whiskey. What I should make very clear, we're actually here talking about Scotch whiskey specifically. There are likely things happening in other countries. I would venture to say the Irish whiskey, there's definitely something with Irish whiskey that's quite murky out there. I don't know anything about the US, but it wouldn't surprise me either, or other whiskeys from around the world. Actually, I'll put this to you, Laurence and Mark. Have you heard of anything, ugly rumors happening from other parts of the world around this kind of thing as well?
I've not seen as much with other propositions elsewhere in the world, and I think the uniqueness about Scotch whiskey is like the length of maturation. For American whiskey, you've got 7 years or so tops in many cases before your ABV shoots too high and your volume shoots too low. And there's been a lot of overselling. There's people that are buying that have bought dozens and dozens of pallets of bourbon and stuff, but I've not seen this ownership issue, because again, America, that ownership, and I don't see why the FCA doesn't see these cask certificates as being a security, which is exactly what they are, but they don't. So I've not seen it much elsewhere with the rest of the world side of things personally.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from my perspective, yes, there were stories elsewhere that we looked at and weren't able to feature for various reasons. But I think, just to echo that, there is a very particular power that Scotch has in the US, and more broadly even than that. And that's something that it's more democratic. Yes, there is a kind of luxury positioning of Scotch, but ultimately people have heard of it. We had victims in America who had never tried it, but Scotch for them was a byword for luxury and history and tradition and trustworthiness and all that kind of stuff, which casts a spell over people. So I think it's no coincidence, although there's some, the kind of regulatory gaps and ease with which people have moved into this. It's also because it's easy to flog. Right? People like it.
Yeah. And I think this is the ironic thing
Romantic,
is
it's romantic.
Scotch whiskey's been so well protected from every point in the world. Like, you know what I mean? It's extremely well protected. But it seems like the industry can't really see the damage that a BBC documentary about scamming whiskey is going to have, because as soon as that went live and as soon as the trailer started going live, like everybody who knew me, like friends, acquaintances, whatever, was sending me messages saying, have you seen this? Have you seen this? Have you seen this? Like, yeah, that's kind of what I've been talking about for 5 years. It's like, it's all coming, like, we know this. And like, and I think the biggest, and this is how the scammers have kind of got to sort of like to this point, is that the whole whiskey industry is based on taking a young product that is cheap to produce. Like Macallen's, God knows what Macallen's cost of production is on a hyper modern site like they've got built in 2018. And yet the longer you mature it, the more valuable it becomes. Like this identity issue that whiskey has in terms of quality or what it is, but it's age that seems to drive the price. And like, you know, you go back to these historic sales, like the Springbank distillery, the Bruichladdich distillery, the Macallen distillery, the Arran distillery, you know, dozens of these distilleries all had ownership schemes. There's still a lot of them now, like Arran. I think Eden Mill have just started up again. I think Glasgow maybe still do a cask ownership scheme. A lot of them have cask ownership schemes, and a lot of the people who bought into those legitimate schemes are making a good return. Like they've had perspective, they've waited 20 years or so, you know, they paid a fair price and they had the right paperwork for it. But you then layer that ounce of truth against what these people have been trying to missell, and they just amplify everything. And you come onto this thing about like 10% annual returns. There's a degree of truth in it, but it's completely not right, because that's only realized when you're selling a very mature cask at the very end after you've held it for 20 years. You know what I mean? You can't buy it today and sell it next year or next week or whatever. Like it's a long-term thing.
Well, we're gonna have a look at this soon, gentlemen. I'm actually gonna weigh in quickly. We've got some more comments. I think Instagram's the only place where I can read them right now. So apologies if you're commenting on Facebook or LinkedIn. I can't see them. Mark Watts, hello, Mark. I'll see you next month. Asked, do you think social media should be doing more to protect the public to the bombardment of cask investment companies that are clearly untrustworthy? Sean Murphy asks, hi, Sean. Do you think distilleries should do more to get the information out there? Now, and then Gary Mills asked, do we think the downturn is playing a part? Some brokers looking to move casks on for cash flow end up being less diligent than who they sell to. So triple question there. I will attempt to answer this quickly so we can move quickly as well. What I'll say about Mark, what I'll say is, how on earth can we trust social media to do anything about anything, worrying about information? Forget that. Zuckerberg is not your friend here, right? Nor is Musk, nor is any of it, because how on earth are they supposed to know? So in that sense, I would say it's in a way not their duty, because they've abandoned their duty on so many other things across the world that there's no hope there. I think you can report ads, but honestly, you know, we've seen how far that goes. So your best bet, I would say, and even then, it's not been very effective at all. As I will show you all soon, you can report bad ads to the ASA, the Advertising Standards Authority, and the ASA is aware that there's a lot of people saying some garbage about whiskey investment. But even then, I'm still bombarded by the ads saying the same lies. So, unfortunately, Sean asked you. So, as for distilleries, and should they do more to get the information out there? Yes, it's not just distilleries, though. It's got to be
Everyone.
and nobody wants to take responsibility. It's really, really frustrating. I mean, I think personally, it's got to be the SWA. In my opinion, they right now, and as far as I'm aware, don't seem to really want to tackle the subject too hard. You can kind of understand why in communications I've seen about it, or in things they've said about it publicly. I can kind of see why they've not wanted to. But because Laurence is showing, it's getting to the point where it's really too much of an issue. So the line that I like to use, that I think is so crucial, you know, and this will tie into the next comment we got. The golden age of Scotch whiskey that is now about to end. Great whiskey relies on honesty, integrity, and transparency. The best stories come from this. The reason we fell in love with the industry comes from this. The best distilleries work very much valuing these principles. All of a sudden, we're seeing something that undermines it on every single one of these fronts. And because the SWA's remit is to protect the values that make Scotch whiskey great and therefore keep it as a valuable product held in high esteem around the world, they should be weighing in. That's my opinion. And there is a good debate to be had about that, but the industry's got to do more. It's got to come from the industry.
And the problem is it's so nuanced. You can't say that Cask investment is good or bad. Like, it's just not that simple. Like, there's huge degrees of like, and you can't just put like, look to the ownership. Look at the misinterpretation of like 3 excise notices, and it should have just been really clear. Get a delivery order. Did anyone come out and say against that? No. Like, so if we're not even going to say against that, then like what Felipe is saying, it's so nuanced and yeah.
And then to the other comment that Gary is making as to whether the downturn is playing a part, to a degree, I mean, the downturn is fairly recent. We were seeing these companies pop up before, but what we are seeing with the downturn is, so we're seeing organizations, prize bodies, festivals that previously probably wouldn't have touched these people, taking their cash all of a sudden. And because brands are cutting their marketing budgets. Brands don't want to spend anymore. So these are the places that are happy to give you their cash, therefore reinforcing the vicious cycle. Sorry, Mark, go for it.
I was just going to say a really interesting point on that. Was it Gary that asked this question? Gary, it's a great question, but I think the one safety that we've got now is high interest rates. People have got somewhere else to put their money to see a return, whereas this whole era, and it wasn't just social media, it was the economic climate of having near zero interest rates for 13 years that made people have to sort of seek an alternative investment. And all of this rose, like, at the same time as like NFTs and the whole rise of other mainstream like alternative investments. So I think it was that whole perfect storm of everything brewing there. And I think that the higher interest rates is putting people off putting money into things like a Cask now, which we'll see a lot of these companies start to fold. And we're seeing this a lot with the salespeople. They're all moving on, and it's happening in the art industry. A lot of the art galleries are run on people on commission. As soon as the commissions start falling, they move into a different area, double glazing, whatever. They don't care what they're selling. They just need to make that commission.
The other thing, so another comment we're getting here. So Mark Watt has said a lot of the distillery cask sales to the public only offered a certificate and not a delivery order. The point I'll make this is I'm emphasizing. So what I was emphasizing is contact between, and the law says not a delivery order, contact between the warehouse and the purchaser. So when you're talking to a distillery directly, you don't really need a delivery order because you've already got that contact happening directly. Mark, am I interpreting that correctly?
Yeah, exactly. Like if the warehouse keeper says you kiss them under a full moon to get that cask in your own name, that's what you've got to do. It's the warehouse keeper that's got to satisfy their own rules. The delivery order is perfect because it's a countersigned document. But essentially, when a distillery sells you a cask, it's that warehouse saying you own this cask. That's it. There's no person in the middle of that chain, like Felipe says. There's no person disrupting that communications.
Yeah. So one thing I thought I'd present to you, gentlemen, is we were talking about misinformation and advertising. Well, I pulled some ads for us to look at. Yes. And I think this, by showing these ads, is showing kind of exactly this. I think I've got 2 ads for you. Both of them pulled this month. One literally an hour before it went on because they're all over my social media. And I think they show very typically what we've got. So here's the first one for you. Let's see if it actually loads up. And there we have it. Can we see that okay, gentlemen?
Yes.
Cool. So I've blanked out anything relevant here. So let's have a look at this. So we're looking at a high rate of return. We're seeing the capital gains tax exemption. That's been a popular line for a while now. Secure HMRC bonded warehouses. That applies to every single cask ever. And essentially, and then the case study there at the bottom. There is a lot to be said about this little case study there. So
please let me
go. Very typical example of the ad you see and the misinformation that's out there. Gentlemen, would either of you like to take a crack at this first, or should I?
Hell yeah.
Mark, go for it. Let's lend some
tomatoes. And this is it. Capital gains free. Like, yes, I think broadly speaking, casks of whiskey, when sold in bond, have been capital gains tax free. They're a wasting asset. We know a lot of people who have paid for a lot of professional advice, in some cases taken home 500,000 up to £1 million from the sale of a cask, and they've sought very robust tax advice on this. And historically, always seek your own advice, that the sales of casks have been capital gains tax free. In bottles are not a wasting asset, so they are subject to capital gains tax. So you start off with the truth of something that's exciting. But then you kind of get into this nonsense of this pyramid selling. And I think one of our earlier commenters said how hard it is to exit. And yeah, the only exit for a cask of whiskey or a whiskey cask investment is to take a young cask and sell it as a mature cask into the industry. You sell it to an independent bottler, because that is the only ethical way to do it, because you're then taking your personal investment and then selling it to become like a business decision. Is this price being fair for my business? Well, you're a professional in the business. You know what your margins are. Can you make money on it? Yes or no? It gets really murky when you see what happens at the bottom of this ad when customer is sold back to another customer, because then who are you working for? What's your position? Are you trying to get the seller the highest priced or the buyer the lowest price? Because you certainly can't represent both. And look, come on. Like I was an auctioneer for a decade before I set up my own business. Like the oldest trick in the book is to stick something into auction, to run the price up to make it look attractive to people, and then use those figures to sell and make more sales. And this is exactly what it looks like happens here. One customer buys a cask and they resell it to another cask. Well, hang on, like you're not representing either of them fairly. And you know what? Let's just buy it back so we've got some figures to stick on social media. It's just nonsense. And I think Laurence will testify to this. Like I often experience people who try and sell a cask with another one of the companies that said you could hold it for 1 or 2 years. You can't. You've got to wait 10, 20 years. And then all of a sudden, this is when the problems start coming, because there's more profit to sell somebody a new cask with all that profit loaded into it than it is to take a cask that's already had the profit in it and then resell it. So I don't know what your experience with that is, Laurence, but
yeah, well, I was going to say that this one of the companies that we didn't feature in the research for looking into them, they had garnered a lot of press in, mainstream papers with a kind of good news story of dad of 3 sells a cask of whiskey that he'd forgotten about for like £5,000, 5,000% return or something absolutely, gigantic like that. Now, you have to scroll all the way through the news story to find that the person who bought it is a whiskey cask investment company that is pitching themselves as telling you that Cask Whiskey Investment is amazing. It's what we saw time and time again is like massively inflated kind of prices or potential, but in reality, as soon as you scratch the surface of that, it was very difficult to even with companies that we looked at and didn't feature because they're just not working on like the scale of, or they're not working as deviously as the companies that we featured. There's lots of claims out there, but
that good news story.
Yeah,
that good news story that you're on about, that wasn't Macallen. That was bought in 1996. And there's loads of Macallen out there, 1988, 89, occasionally 93 as well. But they were all bought in 1996, give or take. And that cask that he saw a 5,000% return on, he bought it as part, like those casks were shut down by the Serious Fraud Office for overcharging. But this is it. You've got a degree of truth. He did see a 5,000% return, but then you're exactly right. It's manipulated into such a ridiculous way that it's just not. And this is what I mean. I think it's like abusive position. When you look at the Fraud Act, it's that abusive position, and people believe that, oh my gosh, right, these guys are reporting. There's no counter narrative to tell them otherwise. So, yeah, like that flies.
And I think the other thing to pick up in this advert and to pick up across a lot of the cask whiskey investment industry is what there is never a mention of anywhere. A very, very few sites spoke about selling to high net worth individuals for them to drink. But what there is basically never a mention of is that whiskey is a comestible product. Someone somewhere has to want to pay and drink that whiskey or bottle it or whatever. Somewhere in the line, it's going to have to be, transformed from this asset that keeps going up into a food product. And that is a thing that is deeply hidden in the messaging, in the very simplistic messaging that you find on social media, because it's an uncomfortable truth. And when you think about it long enough, it starts to change how you might approach that as an investment. Because nobody can think 10, 20 years ahead with any certainty. You have to be willing to maybe do that yourself.
Yeah,
I also
exactly.
want to point out here, what we're seeing here from the ad is we know now that ad shows you how this business works. They gather a huge sales lead, a huge amount of sales leads, and they can pass on a hot potato onto each other, stuck within their own little bubble ecosystem with somebody eventually catching fire. Really, also what it shows that this company doesn't rely on whiskey as its product. It's the sales leads coughing up money for them. That's their product. And then the ones that actually make a little bit of money can then be used in ads like this.
And I
So,
think as well, like the difference is as well, like there's again one of our earlier commenters, I think he said how difficult it is to exit these. That's absolutely right. But and that's with the historic relatively low levels of sales. What about when everybody comes to try and exit their cask of Macallen or Stoisha or Whitlaw, which no one cares about because it's a secondary name, and there's not really a market for that now, like let alone in 20 years time. Like it's baffling. But again, it's all being supplied.
the other thing I'll mention is something very clear that I really feel I should emphasize here. And sorry, Laurence, I'll get to it now. There is no actual good data on sales of casks for investment. We don't have that data. So there is that data for bottles at auction. There's that data for Lego sets, even quite detailed data. We know what the history is with every single thing that gets sold on the secondary market. When it comes to cask investment, no actual, proper, transparent, strong data exists. It's completely opaque, completely dark, and we know nothing. Even us in the industry, we know nothing. Sorry, Laurence, go for it.
I was just going to say that the other thing, in terms of a kind of operating method, I think, is that we didn't have time to get into in the podcast or the show, is that there are other markets, and I know from speaking to people in the whiskey world that Asia as a market for cask whiskey investment and for bottle investment is basically there and unaware of and perhaps even less cynical of this industry. And so yes, there's going to be a lot of people trying to exit in 3-5 years time, and there probably will be a kind of recon, like a group of people who are hoovering up those things and selling them to another market where the kind of the knowledge just isn't there.
Well, the knowledge, I would say, is not even quite here, which shows just how scary the issue is. Gentlemen, let's remove this ad and let's put on another one. Though I think I kind of almost gave it away with the little speech I just gave. Let me look at this one now. And here we are. Yes. Now we're looking at long-term opportunities. Talk about data. Mark or Laurence, either of you want to throw some tomatoes? Otherwise, I can do it.
Asset under your control? No, it's not. You're not getting a delivery order. And I'll just say it's quite ironic now that a lot of these companies who've been lambasting me personally for years saying you need the delivery order. Oh, no, you don't. No, you don't. Oh, look, we've got a warehouse now. You need the delivery order. We're the only company giving delivery orders. Back off, get to the back of the line. Like, no, you're not. Like, this is like, and this is the thing, is like you're now seeing some of these companies try to go legitimate based on a possibly like an illegitimate business practice for a long time. And that's what, not under your control.
I was just going to say, I mean, from the perspective of a lot of the victims, a really key point was that they were told that they would own the whiskey. And the pitch, if you watch the show that is given from the company that we do a sting on, is even if we go bust, you own your whiskey. So there's a kind of offer there to people, which is, this is zero risk for you. The risk is on us, and the lie that's told there, and the lie that was the case with Case Alexander in the US, is that not only is there a markup, but there is also commission being owned by that company or salesperson, and that is the thing that a lot of people in the industry, it's so easy to, for you guys, you go, yeah, of course, that's just not how it works. And so to make that statement seems ridiculous. That knowledge just isn't there outside the industry, and it's hard to get to, and it's kind of knotty and complex. And so people take it on face value, and that is unfortunately why there's so many people stung.
And then the other one I'll throw in there, there's reference. So I talked about how data is opaque here. There's reference to what sounds like very good official data about returns on whiskey cask investment. I repeat again, there is no serious transparent data. It does not exist. That specific index required, that's mentioned, I've looked at it. The data ain't transparent there either. There's a lot of numbers that don't make sense because no context is provided. And again, compared to the bottle market, compared to the Lego market. I like talking about Lego because I recently found out about the Lego auction site, and it kind of almost is like with the bottles that you can keep track of different products. There is no transparent data. All right, let's take this head down. So we are running into the conclusion of things. I'm going to put in one more audience question, an anonymous question here. And this is a good, important question, I think. And I think so. We talked, Laurence, to you about the victims you've spoken with. Mark, I know that you've also been in touch with lots of victims as well. So to both of you, this very important question: what were some of the impacts on victims beyond just the financial element? What did they go through as well? Mark or Laurence, I'll leave it to you.
Go on, Laurence, you go on this.
Well, we found people who hadn't told their families the true scale of the loss. We found people who had contemplated taking their own lives. We found people who would talk to us for background conversations but wouldn't talk on air because of the shame that they felt. Beyond the financial, and I should say that nobody that we spoke to could afford to lose money, whatever that means to you. Nobody we spoke to wasn't massively affected by this. But beyond the financial, there are massive human costs here, which are also about a lack of trust. People having become incredibly nervous about operating online and about who they talk to online, about where their data is being used. People paranoid that when colleagues in the BBC were approaching, that it wasn't the BBC, it was someone after scamming them again. And indeed, there were people who had been scammed again by recovery scams, which are a whole nother conversation. But people promising, we can get this money back for you, we just take 5%, and we're called something that sounds official. But there was a massive impact to everybody we spoke to. And I think one of the biggest difficulties for them is there is little to no redress. A lot of the people, even when there is an active police investigation, feel that they are without any chance of getting their money back in terms of regaining that. There are lots of people out there left in the dark as to whether their asset exists or not, or if it ever did, or if it's sold multiple times. And it consumes people's lives. It totally occupies their mind all the time because it's a horrendous thing. To be burgled is the invasion of your space and all that kind of stuff, but to be defrauded is that, but there is no locale to it, right? It's all in your head and your heart. And so there's a lot of people that are really broken by this.
And I think maybe we should have mentioned this slightly before, an hour into this. But if anybody has bought a cask out there, what are some practical things that you can do to ensure that your investment is safe? Because a lot of people, especially if they've got an hour in, they might have concerns. So the obvious thing, if you've got a certificate and not a delivery order, you need to get that delivery order. You need those casks into your own name at the warehouse, because then even if that company does go bust, there's nothing else that's the gold standard with you having full autonomy over it. And likewise, if you don't get anywhere with that, the obvious thing to do is just report it to the police. If you're being told reasons why you can't have a delivery order, there's something going on there. It doesn't take weeks or months to arrange an uplift. You pick up the phone, the warehouse gets it ready. Sure, it might take a few weeks to get ready, but then it should be available to uplift almost immediately. And if people are telling you anything other than that, just look, either admit that you might have been scammed and call the police or the serious fraud officer or somebody like that, but don't just keep your head in the sands and go, oh yeah, well, I've seen them at Felipe says at this award or this and that. This is it's your own money, and it might be hard to admit this, that you might have been part of a scam and you might not be as intelligent as you think. It's not you were manipulated. So it's not you not being sensible or not being intelligent, it's you were manipulated. So take action and make sure you secure it, because otherwise I just think this is just going to go on and on.
And I think with that, we will end things because we're slightly overrunning. The thing that I will say is, I know we've had a lot of industry people in tonight. I hope you are now more aware of just how serious this problem is. To any of our industry pals who are out there, start talking about this. If you know people in the big corporations that talk to the SWA, send them an email, let them know what's going on. We will be putting this video online. It'll go on Mark's YouTube channel shortly.
On Thursday, yeah.
Because Laurence, thank you so much. There's some incredible information here from Laurence that I think the industry really needs to be aware of. We got to start talking, people, because the situation is bad, and it should not be an obnoxious American musician and some English boy here talking about what's going on with Scotch whiskey. We need more of you to help us out. We need to get the word out. Every contact you've got, work them. Let them know what's going on if you believe in what we're telling you here, because it's bad. And on that note of doom, good night and thank you, everyone. Mark and Laurence, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure and a privilege. Thanks to all of you who tuned in. We will be posting this up tomorrow, and please do share far and wide once we do as well, because we want as many people to watch it as possible. And with that, good night, everyone. Cheers and thank you.